Hi guys, today I'm going to walk you through the process. I'm just going to straighten my phone. I'm going to walk you through the process of learning how to do watercolor and applying layers of watercolor to get your desired effect and working quite quickly. So watercolor is a medium that is used often by people who are sketching on site to kind of get a quick sort of study of the color. Again, I'm going to straighten up my phone. There we go. So these are a couple of quick demos that I did with my 10s last year. And that's what we're gonna do today. You're going to need a watercolor kit, and I might need to come around and put some yellow because we seem to be low on yellow. Now, a lot of you might notice that the watercolor kits look like they're almost empty, but watercolor goes a long way. It stretches a lot further than oil paint or acrylic paint or most other kinds of paint. Like, you just add water to it and it's highly pigmented, so it goes on forever. You're going to need a watercolor brush. I'm going to use this one, which is sort of like a medium-ish one. If you use one of the big ones, you're going to need to be careful how much water you put on it because you don't want to saturate your paper. You're going to need your sketchbook. Now, watercolor paper is better. It is more absorbent. It's tougher. It can withstand a lot of moisture, and especially if it's made out of a high cotton content, it can take a lot more. So we're going to have to sort of not go in too wet, and I almost want to do that strategically, and I'll show you why. You're going to need a ruler. Now, don't, just kind of eyeball this. Don't bother about measuring it for now because that takes too much time. If it's not perfectly straight and the lines aren't totally perpendicular, it's okay. I'm gonna make this a little bit more square, so I'll end up erasing these lines later. And normally you would need an onion. So we're gonna do this. This is where things get a little different this year because I'm not having everybody use an onion because that just becomes too difficult. So we're gonna work along in stages. Feel free to look at a picture of an onion on your phone. Just make sure it is sort of a round spherical onion and not like a spring onion or a scallion or a leek or something. And I like to get onions that have sort of peeling layers and hairy bits coming off of them. So you're gonna start by doing a rough outline of your image, and I'm just gonna kind of rest that there. You know what, I'm gonna prop it up on my Sharpie, and it might behave and cooperate with me, but yeah, no. Okay, maybe it won't do that. I'll do my best. Oh, you also might want some paper towel to clean your brush in between. Come on, onion, stay up for me. Good enough. Okay, so you're gonna do sort of a rough outline of your onion. It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't sweat it. I mean, it's an onion. If you don't do it exactly the same as the onion that we're looking at, really, nobody's gonna know as long as it looks, generally speaking, like an onion. Now, sometimes what I do when I work in watercolor by myself is I use a watercolor pencil to do my drawing. And so what ends up happening is once it gets wet, it just sort of gets absorbed into the painting itself. But we're going to be going over this with pen once it dries, so it doesn't really matter, and I don't really want to spend time distributing the watercolor pencils. So just try to work fairly lightly when you're drawing. Don't go in really heavy with your heavy hands. So I'm gonna sort of hold my palette. Hopefully there's enough palettes for us to do that. And I often start a lot of my watercolor paintings with a color that is called yellow ochre, which is basically the color of baby poo. And I know that sounds really disgusting, but basically it's a browny kind of yellow. It is sort of a color that we see in nature a lot. And so I'm just gonna put an underpainting or a base in there, and you'll see that I'm not going in super wet. So my paper's not gonna warp too much. And if you go out of your edges, that's okay. You can work that into your background. I just find that working with a really pale background of that sort of yellow ochre, and sometimes like what I would call an ultramarine blue, which is sort of a dark, slightly purpley blue, creates sort of an interesting dimension. A lot of artists use what they call underpaintings, where they set their values. So we've got one layer on here. We're gonna let this dry, and I'm gonna go on to my apple demo. Okay, so this is relatively dry now. So I'm gonna go in and add another layer to it. And my onion kind of rolled around on me, as onions do. So, now I think I was mentioning that people, when they work with watercolor, they tend to make the mistake of going in and they almost put too much pigment onto the surface. And I don't know a better way of describing this, and it's certainly not a technical way of describing it, but when we have watercolor paint, we have what's called a pigment. So the pigment is the material that they use to get the color from. Sometimes it's a heavy metal, you know, like Iron Maiden. And sometimes it's from like a mineral or some kind of part of the earth, and they bind it with usually something like a gum arabic and sometimes a honey, like actual bee honey. And what happens is once you put water on it, the stuff sticking the pigment together releases. And I find that if you put too much water on, it's almost like the pigment is drowning and trying to scramble to the edge of the beach, and you get this like cauliflower effect. So I usually try to work a lot drier than people think watercolor ought to be. So I've gone in with an orange. I'm going in with the red now, and I'm just kind of creating some interesting layers. Watercolor is all about patience, so waiting for your layers to dry. I find it kind of very relaxing when I go hiking, and it's a very portable medium, so I can jam a bunch of paint and drawing stuff into my backpack or my bike pannier and go and sit somewhere on a rock or on a log and just sort of draw. And then I do a layer, I wait for it to dry, and then I do another layer. So I'm gonna let this dry, and then I'm gonna sort of go in with my purpley stuff. So my water is still pretty clean. Every now and then you just want to give your water a check, and if it's really muddy and dark and everything, you want to chuck it out and switch it. What some watercolor painters do is they actually have 2 water jugs on the go. So they clean their brush in one and then shake it off, and then imagine this is one with clean water. They dip it in there to make their brush wet. I personally never do that, and I've been painting with watercolor since like 1982. Actually before that. But it's not a bad idea. We don't have room to do that though, so we're not going to do that. I'm just telling you about it in case you want to do it at home. So my red onion is sort of like actually purpley, and so I want to go in. Now this purple in this kit is a very nice sort of royal purple, which would be perfect if I was painting the queen in her imperial state crown or something like that. But this onion is actually sort of more of a reddy brown, rusty kind of color. So I'm gonna, most watercolor palettes come with a mixing area here. These things are called wells, and every now and then you might want to just kind of wipe them out, or work with what you've got given to you and see what happens. I'll just wipe this out a little bit. Now when I go painting, when I go hiking, I'm notorious for forgetting paper towel, and I end up just kind of wiping it on my pants or my socks, but your parents might get mad at you if you do that. So yeah, if I don't want to kind of go in with this deep purple because it's almost like too purple. So I'm gonna sort of mix up some colors here with the red, and I'm just gonna play around maybe with some of the brown. Yeah, why don't I, kind of liking that, maybe a bit more purple. Ooh, look at that, look at that. That's kind of, ooh, look at that. Okay, so I'm gonna go in now and I'm gonna start adding some more layers. And I want you to sort of bear in mind while you're working on this is that you're going to go in later and add some of the fine detail with a black pen, your Sharpie. So you're almost just sort of filling in basic little color swatches. Okay. And I want this a little bit more purple for this sort of inside area and a little less brown. And I want to let that dry, and you've noticed I've got stuff all over the place. So because I'm done my pencil crayon drawing, I don't have anything to work on while I'm waiting for this to dry, which means I'm going to get impatient. So we do have some hair dryers that you can use. We only have like 1 or 2, so you're going to have to share them, and we're going to have to be very careful. I might actually just zhuzh over it so that I'm the only one touching it, and there's actually only 1 plug anyway. Make sure that if you're ever sort of using the hair dryer in the dryer cupboard, that you don't grab one of the heat guns, because you will literally set your sketchbook on fire. When I taught mechanics, I had a kid who burned a hole through his shoe with a heat gun. So, generally speaking, you want to use warm, not hot. And then so it's dry enough to do another layer. And I'm pretty pleased with this rich sort of purpley color I'm developing here. Whoops. Okay, so I'm going to create some shadow so that my onion isn't just floating in space. And actually I'm going to show you a technique that I use for blending colors. I think I've mentioned that when I work with watercolors, I basically never use black or white. So if I want to make it gray or black, I blend what's called a burnt umber and an ultramarine together. So basically dark brown and dark blue. Oh, sorry, do you want me to put my mask on? Sorry. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't thinking. So when you mix the dark brown and the dark blue together, you get something that resembles black or gray, but it's a little bit softer or more natural. And I'm trying to figure out what the true shadow is. It's kind of on top of a green rubber ruler right now, and the ruler is distorting it. So I'm just flicking stuff all over the place. I don't know what's going on with this brush. Anyway, I'm gonna just have to work that into the design. Tell people I did it on purpose. And because we have multiple light sources, so we have light coming from the window over there, and we have light coming from above and outside the room, we have actually different shadows. We don't just have one neat little tiny shadow hanging out by itself behind the onion. Okay, and I'm actually going to use some of this gray that I created to build up some of the values in my onion. Ooh, but not that much. So when you're looking at the light and shadow on anything, really, there's always what's called a reflected light. And it's like the light comes down and it bounces off the surface. So if you have a light coming from here, there's going to be a little wing of light just on the very edge. So it'll go like dark, 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 light, and then dark again. And just like if you can kind of start to pay attention to that while you're actually drawing and observing the things that you're drawing. That would be awesome. And I'm gonna create some of that purple again so that I'm ready for going in with some more layers. But what I'm going to do right now is dry this. Wow, I'm just flicking paint. I don't know why I'm flicking so much paint today. It must be like paint flicking Friday or something. I'm gonna like to try and fix up this edge a bit. I'll be back. So I'm gonna do my edge. And it doesn't have to be perfectly straight. Basically what you're doing here is getting into the practice of thinking about your composition, thinking about framing your work, and making sure that you're not doing like a little tiny onion in the corner here, which might be drawn really well, but I kind of want you to do a nice sizable onion. I think that's what I'll call this piece. Now, what I would... Is it taping? Yeah, it's taping. What I would normally do at this point is color in some of this, but I think because I made such a huge, massive, ridiculous mess there, I'm going to actually paint around it. What color would be nice? We have sort of purple. I'm just going to go in with a blue. I think these brushes are a lot more absorbent or sort of moppy than I usually work with sort of little round brushes. And so I'm getting accustomed to these brushes again. I just want to fill in this area because that's what I want to do. That's, you know. And I'm still going to see those paint splotches underneath, but it does kind of make my onion stand out a bit more. So I don't think I need to paint the background on the in the square that I've drawn the onion in. So maybe like while you're working with your brushes and shaking, give them a good shake inside the yogurt container. And yeah, let's go in with a little bit more purple, and then I think I'm gonna let it dry and go in with my pen. having to make a little bit more. And will it be exactly the same? Probably not. That's okay. So when you're working with your watercolor, you might want to do little color swatches on your paper. Like I feel fairly confident in my own personal color blending technique that I don't usually do that, but sometimes, you know, I pay the price. I get a little lazy and I don't do that. I do know a lot of artists who do make meticulous sort of pre-studies of colors, and I maybe could be better at that too, but I tend to be very sort of like quick, and you know, when I was your age I used to be very slow and precise and meticulous, and now I think just because I have such a hectic life, I'm sort of like wham bam thank you ma'am, and like whoa, chucking my brush around, doing all that stuff. Thank you, cleaner guy. I didn't get the chance to clean you. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just gonna leave it there, and I'm gonna let that dry, and then I'm gonna go in with my pen. So when you're done with these watercolor palettes, what we're gonna do is we're gonna close them up, and then we're gonna use the wipes I'll bring the bin down, and then you'll just put them back in the container. Same with the brushes. You're gonna wash them really well, and then we'll clean the handles and put them back in the container. Okay, I thought I was recording while I was doing my inking, but I guess I wasn't. So I've started to go in with my ink. Before you go in with ink, make sure that your paint is totally dry, or else your ink will bleed all over the place. The ink that we're going to use is our fine liners, the Sharpie fine liners, and ink and watercolor work really well together. They're like an old married couple, like my parents, who have been married for 60 years, since 1960. I didn't get to visit them for their 60th anniversary this summer. That was a drag, but they're both in their 80s. So anyway, so I don't really want to go in with too much more line on here, but you can see that the ink that I've gone in with has added a lot more definition to my onion. Too bad I didn't do the sort of hairy end, because I would have had fun playing with those whiskers. And I just want to sort of explain some of the techniques that I've used. So I did some sort of contour lines or outlines, sort of defining where the peels, the outer layer of the onion is peeling away. And I've done some what's called like almost like a cross contouring. So when you follow the form or the curve, like a curved contour, that's what it is, a curved contour, and a cross contour is when you do your curved contour, or you follow the form of your object, and then you follow the other line. So like this. And I'm sort of really kind of observing where the lines or the ribs of the peel are. I've used what's called stippling, which is when you do dots, and sometimes stippling is mistakenly called pointillism, and the two are similar. Pointillism is a painting technique that was developed by the Impressionist painters in France in the 1800s. If you call it pointillism, I will still know what you're talking about. I won't freak out about it. I don't like to be one of those people who gets really persnickety about dialogue and language and terminology. I will try to build up your terminology so you're using the correct terminology, but I also don't expect you to have as an accurate use of terminology as I would, because I went to school for a long time. And the point of communication will have still been met. So, anyway. Anyway, I was talking about stippling. So stippling is a technique that can be very effective, but a lot of the time when people do it, they get lazy and they don't do enough of the dots, and it just looks like random dots on the middle of the surface. Excuse me. Or sometimes they use a nib or a pen that's too big and it starts to look kind of crummy. So I tend to stay away from stippling. I had a friend in high school, Quentin, who really took to stippling, and that just became his thing, and he still does it. But seriously, every period, every class, he was just going dot 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 dot, and it drove me nuts. I don't know, maybe I didn't have as much patience when I was in high school as I do now, but it did drive me nuts. So I don't want to go in with too much more ink because I don't want to kind of mess this up, but and again, I did this earlier to demonstrate different techniques. So when you're using ink, and this applies to whether you're using India ink with a dip pen or other forms of ink, there's hatching, which is putting lines beside each other. If you crisscross those lines or hatches in any number of directions, it's called cross hatching. We have curved contour, and then we have cross contour, which is when you're kind of following the form of the surface that you're trying to render. If you kind of do little scribbles, you're doing what's called scumbling, and this can be really good if you're doing sort of brick and bracken nature or curly hair or something like that. And then there's that pointillism, which I told you about. And then there's any number of ways that you can kind of combine these techniques to get the effect that you want. I'm just going to show you one more thing. I just want to bring out some of the highlights. Now, what I personally like to use is white gel marker, and my favorite is Uniball Signo, but we don't have enough money to buy those for everybody. So pencil crayon on top of watercolor actually works really well because the pigment in the watercolor absorbs the wax. So I'm just kind of going in and bringing out a few of my highlights, which isn't as dramatic as if I was using a white gel marker. But sometimes you don't want it to be super dramatic, because sometimes you don't want things to be stark white. And I'm gonna go in actually with a yellow. Just to add a little bit more dimension to this little onion. And then I'm gonna name it. Where's my pen? I gotta go get my pen. So I think it's important to label the work that you do in your sketchbook, but also if you're ever gonna post stuff online, it's really important that you put your name on it so that people don't steal it. I like to give things titles. I'm gonna call this Little Old Onion in Petunia Patch, which you may or may not know is based on an old song, like even before my time, but there used to be a song that went, I'm a little old petunia in an onion patch. And so this is just a play on that. And I'm going to sign my name, whoopa whoopa, and put the date 2020. And that's my onion. Right, okay, have fun.